They laughed when a black honor student was forced to read aloud. Her stutter turned into a cruel classroom spectacle. Her teacher smirked. Some people just aren't meant for excellence, as the entire room joined in the humiliation. But when a photo slipped from the girl's notebook, revealing an elderly woman in uniform, the teacher sneered. Even your ancestors look confused. What no one knew was that photo hid a secret powerful enough to silence every single laugh, and the next day the truth walked straight into that classroom. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The classroom buzzed with the kind of restless chatter that always came before lunch. Students tapped their pencils, exchanged whispers, and shuffled papers, waiting for their teacher's signal. In the middle of the second row sat Harper Lewis, shoulders rounded inward, notebook open but barely touched. At 14, she carried herself with a gentleness that some mistook for weakness. Her dark curls framed a face that often looked toward the ground rather than outward, as though she could hide from the world if she stayed small enough. Harper had a stutter, an unpredictable, halting disruption that clutched her words before they could leave her lips. Most days she managed to keep herself invisible, only speaking when absolutely necessary. Today, however, Mrs. Aldridge had other plans. Mrs. Aldridge, a woman in her late 50s, stood at the front of the classroom, like a conductor preparing for her orchestra. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the restless room. "All right, everyone. Settle down. We're continuing our oral readings of To Kill a Mockingbird. Each of you will take a turn. Yes, all of you." The class groaned, but Harper's heart sank. She had prayed she might escape, that the rotation would somehow skip her. She knew from experience how it would go. The awkward pauses, the muffled snickers, the tightening of her chest as her own voice betrayed her. "Harper," Mrs. Aldridge announced suddenly, her eyes narrowing with that faint smirk she often wore. "Why don't you lead us off?" A wave of nervous laughter rippled through the class. Harper froze. Her palms grew clammy, her throat dry. She stared at the page, but the words blurred. "Page 73, paragraph 2, Mrs. Aldridge instructed. Go ahead." Harper opened her mouth. A. Atticus. Her tongue locked, her lips trembling against the sound. Mrs. Aldridge let the silence stretch, arms folded. "Take your time," she said. But there was no warmth in her tone. It was a command laced with amusement. A boy in the back whispered, "Here we go," and a few chuckles broke loose. Harper tried again, forcing the syllables. "A," Atticus said. She squeezed her eyes shut, as the words shattered into fragments. Mrs. Aldridge sighed dramatically. "Class, let's all wait while Harper finds her voice." The smirk deepened. This might take a while. The laughter came freely now, louder, harsher. A girl covered her mouth, pretending to cough but clearly laughing. Harper felt her cheeks burn. She wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor. "Maybe if you tap the desk each time you get stuck," Mrs. Aldridge continued, "you'll keep the rhythm. Why don't you try it, Harper? Tap, stutter, tap, stutter. Let's see." The cruelty was disguised as instruction, but the class understood the performance. They leaned forward, entertained. Harper's hands shook as she tapped the desk timidly, her stutter tangling with the rhythm. The sound only made the laughter sharper. She wanted to scream, but all that came was broken syllables. Finally, Mrs. Aldridge cut her off. "Enough. We don't have all day. Someone else will read." She snapped her fingers toward another student, who quickly picked up where Harper left off. The room moved on, but Harper couldn't. She sat frozen, every muscle taut, her face hot with humiliation. Her notebook trembled beneath her hand. She stared at the lines she had written earlier, though the words no longer made sense. For the rest of the period, Harper kept her gaze fixed downward. The voices around her faded into a dull buzz. Inside, she replayed the scene, Mrs. Aldridge's smirk, the laughter, her own voice failing her again and again. She wanted to disappear, but even invisibility had been stolen from her. Now she was marked, remembered as the girl who couldn't even finish a sentence. When the bell finally rang, the students spilled into the hallway, still whispering, "Tap, stutter, tap, stutter." One boy mocked, drumming on his binder as his friends laughed. Harper lingered, waiting for the room to empty before packing her things. She reached for her notebook, clutching it to her chest like armor. She told herself she wouldn't cry, not here, not in this classroom where humiliation lingered like a sour smell. Mrs. Aldridge remained at her desk, shuffling papers. Without looking up, she said, Harper, you really need to work on that. High school is no place for hesitation. Life won't wait for you to finish your words. Harper swallowed hard, nodding, though no sound came out. You're smart enough, Mrs. Aldridge continued, her tone sharp but dismissive. But being smart isn't enough if people can't understand you. Think about that. It was a dismissal cloaked as advice, but Harper heard what it really meant. You're not good enough. She turned to leave, her notebook pressed tightly against her. As she swung her backpack over her shoulder, the notebook slipped, hitting the floor with a soft thud. Papers scattered. Among them, a photograph slid free, landing face up near Mrs. Aldridge's feet. Mrs. Aldridge bent to pick it up. It was worn, edges curled, colors faded with age. The image showed a black woman in crisp military uniform, her posture proud, eyes fierce despite the sepia tone. Mrs. Aldridge raised her brow, lips twisting in faint amusement. And who might this be? Some relative of yours playing dress-up? She held the photo up so the classmate lingering at the door could see. Harper froze. Her chest tightened, breath caught halfway. She reached out, desperate to snatch the photo back. But Mrs. Aldridge's grip lingered a moment too long. The woman in the photograph, Harper's grandmother, looked back from another era, strong and unyielding. But in that moment, Harper could only feel exposed, her last piece of private pride revealed before someone determined to make it small. Mrs. Aldridge studied it with narrowed eyes, then placed it on the desk casually. Interesting. Well, gather your things and hurry along. You wouldn't want to keep people waiting again. Harper's fingers trembled as she picked up the photograph, sliding it quickly into her notebook. But the damage was done. Someone had seen. Someone had asked. And she knew Mrs. Aldridge wasn't finished with it. She slipped out of the room, heart pounding, clutching the image like it was the only thing tethering her to strength. What Harper didn't know, what even Mrs. Aldridge didn't know, was that the photograph carried more weight than either of them could imagine. Because her grandmother wasn't just a woman in uniform. She was someone whose story could unravel everything. Harper hurries down the hall, unaware that tomorrow, Mrs. Aldridge intends to bring up the mysterious photograph in front of the entire class. The next morning, Harper walked into class with her notebook clutched tightly to her chest, the photograph of her grandmother tucked safely inside. She had barely slept. The memory of Mrs. Aldridge's smirk lingered, the mocking tone echoing in her head. Some relative of yours playing dress-up? Harper had replayed that moment again and again, each time wishing she had found the courage to speak up, to defend the woman in the photo. But her voice had been locked away, trapped the same way it always was when too many eyes turned toward her. When Harper entered the classroom, she noticed right away that the air felt different. A handful of students were already whispering, their eyes flicking toward her as she walked past. At first she thought it was just her imagination, until one girl near the window leaned toward her friend and whispered, just loud enough for Harper to hear, "That picture. Who even wears a uniform like that?" Harper's stomach dropped. She slid into her seat quickly, her eyes on her desk. She hadn't realized anyone else had gotten a good look at the photograph. But the truth was obvious now. Someone had seen enough yesterday to spread the word. As more students filed in, the murmurs grew. Was it like her grandma? Or some random lady from a magazine? One boy snickered. Another added, looked like she was trying to salute, but she just looked stiff. The comments carried the sharp sting of mockery, disguised as curiosity. The bell rang, and Mrs. Aldridge strode in, her heels clicking against the floor. She carried her usual air of authority, but there was something extra in her expression this morning, an almost eager glint in her eye, as though she had been waiting for this moment. "Before we begin," Mrs. Aldridge said, setting her papers down, "I think we should address something interesting that came up yesterday." Harper froze. Mrs. Aldridge folded her arms and turned toward Harper. "One of our students dropped a photograph. A rather old one. It showed a black woman in a uniform." "Now, Harper, was that yours?" The room went still. Every eye turned toward Harper. Her throat tightened, her hands trembling in her lap. She wanted to deny it, to shake her head and move on. But lying felt impossible. "Yes, ma'am," Harper whispered, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Aldridge raised an eyebrow, lips curving into that same sharp smile. "And who exactly was that? A family member of yours?" Harper hesitated. She wanted to say my grandmother, but the word caught in her throat, heavy with fear. She could already hear the laughter that would follow. "Cat got your tongue again," Mrs. Aldridge said with mock patience. She turned to the class. "Perhaps it's a relative. Though I have to say, even in uniform, she looked a little confused. A ripple of laughter filled the room. Students leaned back in their seats, smirking, whispering, feeding on Harper's silence. Mrs. Aldridge continued, voice dripping with false concern. Sometimes appearances can be deceiving. Just because someone wears a uniform doesn't mean they were anyone important. It could just be, oh, I don't know, costume dress-up. Perhaps even something from a thrift shop. The laughter grew sharper. Harper's eyes stung, but she refused to let tears fall. She kept her gaze on her desk, gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles turned white. Inside, she screamed with the words she couldn't force out. She was important. She mattered. She was more than you will ever understand. But nothing left her lips. Only silence. Mrs. Aldridge let the moment linger, then clapped her hands together. All right, let's move on. Back to our readings. She handed out books, as if she hadn't just cut into Harper with surgical cruelty. The class moved on, but Harper could still feel the whispers crawling along her skin. For the rest of the day, she kept her notebook close, shielding the photograph like it was her last fragment of dignity. Where, across town, in a quiet nursing home that smelled faintly of lavender and disinfectant, Dorothy Lewis sat by her window. At 93, her world had grown smaller, limited to the slow routine of morning check-ins, meals, and the occasional visit from her daughter and granddaughter. But her mind was sharp, her memories vivid, even if few people ever asked about them. She sat with a book in her lap, though she wasn't reading. Instead, she stared out the window, her eyes distant. She thought often of the past, of rooms filled with typewriters, of coded messages scrawled across papers, of nights spent hunched over work that few believed she was capable of. She thought, too, of the silence that followed after the war. The way history forgot her, forgot women like her. She had kept her medals and documents tucked away in a box, not because they weren't real, but because she had learned long ago that no one wanted to hear the story of a black woman who broke codes in secret, while the world applauded men who barely knew her name. Dorothy's gaze softened as she glanced at the small framed photo of Harper on her nightstand. Her granddaughter's face, so gentle and watchful, reminded her of herself at that age, carrying burdens others could not see. She wished she could protect Harper from the world, wished she could teach her that silence was not weakness, but sometimes strength waiting for the right moment. That afternoon, as Dorothy shifted in her chair, a nurse entered with the mail. "Ms. Lewis," the nurse said kindly, handing her a small stack of envelopes. "Nothing too exciting today, I think." Dorothy thanked her, flipping through the pile. Bills, advertisements, a birthday card from her church friend. Then at the very bottom, an envelope that made her pause. It was stark white, sealed tightly, with a government insignia stamped in the corner, the kind she hadn't seen in decades. Her hands trembled slightly as she held it, her breath catching. She turned it over, tracing the official seal with her finger. The envelope was addressed not to Ms. Dorothy Lewis, but to Dorothy A. Lewis, Civilian Specialist, WWII, Arlington Hall. No one had called her that in over 70 years. Dorothy stared at the envelope for a long time, the room suddenly too quiet. Somewhere deep in her chest, old memories stirred, memories she had locked away for most of her life. She broke the seal, her eyes widened as she unfolded the letter, her hands shaking with each line she read. The past was not finished with her. Dorothy gasped softly, realizing the government had not forgotten after all. Something buried long ago was about to come to light. The days following the photograph incident stretched like heavy chains around Harper's small frame. Her silence, once a shield, now became an anchor dragging her further into isolation. Where she had once participated, softly, cautiously, now she barely raised her hand at all. Assignments that required oral presentation went incomplete. When asked to read aloud, she shook her head, and the class erupted into predictable giggles. At first, teachers outside of Mrs. Aldridge's class thought Harper was simply shy, but by the third week, the whispers reached the school counselor. Words like learning disability and speech impediment began circling her name, not as questions, but conclusions. On her midterm report card, a new label appeared beside English and history. At risk special needs consideration, recommend. When Harper saw it, her stomach twisted. She wasn't slow. She wasn't incapable. The words in her head were alive, rich, vivid, flowing like music, but when she tried to let them out, they broke apart, jagged and halting. No one at school seemed willing to believe that silence was not the same as ignorance. Her peers, however, had no trouble believing the worst. Rumors spread like wildfire. "She's in the special class now," one girl whispered, in the hallway. "She can't even talk right." Another boy mimicked her stutter in the cafeteria, tapping the table rhythmically the way Mrs. Aldridge had instructed during that cruel performance. Soon, the taunt of "T tap, a stutter" became a chorus Harper couldn't escape. The cruelty wore her down, piece by piece. At home, she carried her report card in her backpack for 3 days before finally sliding it across the kitchen table, face down, when her mother asked. Her mother, Rochelle Lewis, frowned as she unfolded it. She was a nurse, exhausted from 12-hour shifts, but her tired eyes sharpened the moment she read the comments. "Special needs? At risk?" Rochelle's voice rose, incredulous. "They think you're incapable because you stutter?" Harper lowered her gaze, twisting her fingers together. "It's not just the stutter," she whispered. They think I can't do things, that I'm slow." Rochelle's jaw tightened. "You are not slow, Harper. Don't you ever let them write you off like that." She pushed the report card aside. "Tomorrow I'm going to that school." The next afternoon, Rochelle sat stiff-backed across from Mrs. Aldridge and the school counselor. The counselor, a thin man with kind but distant eyes, shuffled papers as he spoke. "We've observed Harper's reluctance to participate in class, her struggles with oral performance, and her difficulty completing certain assignments. Based on these, we think she may benefit from additional support services." Support services. Rochelle's voice was sharp, or a label to make it easier to ignore her. Mrs. Aldridge folded her hands calmly, her lips forming that thin smile Rochelle already despised. "We all want what's best for Harper. But the reality is, some children simply aren't meant for excellence. They can be kind, they can be diligent, but they won't thrive in advanced environments. It's better to accept that early." Rochelle's hands gripped the armrest of her chair. "You're telling me my daughter, who writes poetry and solves math problems faster than I can, isn't meant for excellence? You're telling me a black girl with a stutter is automatically less than?" The counselor raised his hands gently. "Mrs. Lewis, no one is saying less than. We're just recommending placement where she can succeed." "Where she can succeed," Rochelle repeated bitterly. "Or where she won't threaten anyone's idea of who belongs in the top classes." Mrs. Aldridge's smile never wavered. "This isn't about race, Mrs. Lewis. It's about ability. We can't change the fact that Harper struggles to communicate clearly." "Then maybe you should change how you listen," Rochelle snapped, standing. "Because I refuse to let you bury my daughter under your low expectations." She pulled Harper's report card off the table, folded it into her purse, and walked out. Harper followed silently, heart pounding with both fear and awe at her mother's fire. But deep inside, she still felt the crushing weight of Mrs. Aldridge's words. Some people just aren't meant for excellence. The sentence followed her home, echoing in the quiet moments before sleep, whispering into her thoughts when she opened her books. At night, Harper began writing. Not homework, not essays, but lines of poetry that spilled across the pages of her notebook. She didn't have to say them out loud. On paper, her words flowed effortlessly. She wrote about the sting of laughter in classrooms, about the weight of silence pressing against her throat. She wrote about her grandmother's photograph, the proud uniform, the gaze that seemed unbreakable. Sometimes she wrote in fragments, jagged like her stutter, and sometimes in long, fluid sentences, as though the pen carried the voice she could never quite find. She kept the notebook hidden beneath her pillow, pulling it out when the house was quiet. In those moments, Harper felt powerful, invisible to the world, yes, but powerful in her own private space. Meanwhile, across town, Dorothy Lewis sat in her nursing home, the government letter still unopened on the tray beside her. For hours she had stared at it, her hands trembling whenever she reached for the seal. She had seen enough in her lifetime to know that letters like this carried weight, sometimes more than one heart could bear. Finally, as evening shadows stretched across her room, Dorothy slipped on her glasses and broke the seal. Her breath caught as the paper unfolded, crisp and official. "Dear Ms. Dorothy A. Lewis," it began. "We are writing to inform you that your service as a civilian codebreaker during World War II has recently been declassified. In recognition of your contributions to national security, you are to be honored at a forthcoming ceremony." Dorothy's hands shook violently, the letter rattling as though caught in a storm. 70 years of silence, 70 years of being erased, and now suddenly the world wanted to remember. But beneath the honor was something sharper, a line that made her heart race. We also request a personal interview, as certain files indicate unresolved intelligence operations linked directly to your unit. Dorothy's chest tightened. Unresolved intelligence, files, after all these years, why now? She sank back in her chair, the letter trembling in her lap, her mind flooding with memories she had tried to bury. Dorothy gasped, realizing the government wasn't merely honoring her. They were pulling her back into secrets she thought were long forgotten. The letter trembled in Dorothy's hands long after she finished reading. Her eyes lingered on the embossed seal at the bottom, the sharp lettering of her own name typed neatly across the page, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. The government had remembered her, not as a grandmother sitting in a nursing home chair, but as Dorothy A. Lewis, civilian specialist, Arlington Hall. For 70 years, that identity had been locked behind classified files and silence. Now it had returned, alive, demanding acknowledgement. Dorothy let the paper slip onto her lap and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The walls of her small room seemed to dissolve. She was no longer 93 years old. In a quiet facility, she was 22 again, standing inside a dimly lit operations room, filled with the clatter of typewriters and the urgent voices of officers demanding speed and accuracy. She could hear the buzz of machines spitting out coded enemy transmissions, see the endless strips of paper rolling across desks. She remembered the first time she had been ushered into Arlington Hall, a former girls' school in Virginia converted into a military intelligence center. Hundreds of young women worked there, their fingers flying across keys, their eyes squinting at strange sequences of numbers and letters. But Dorothy and the handful of black women who were recruited were set apart, not by their skill which matched or exceeded their peers, but by their skin. The segregation was immediate. They ate at separate tables. They worked in smaller rooms at the edges of the building. Even in the fight against fascism, the American military found a way to enforce its own hierarchy of worth. Dorothy had accepted it quietly at first, because she wanted to prove herself, because she wanted to believe that brilliance could override prejudice, but it hadn't. She recalled the day a white officer handed her a sheet of numbers scrawled in tight columns. "Busy work," he had muttered, certain she wouldn't get far. Dorothy had taken the sheet back to her desk, her pencil flying across the page as she searched for patterns, rhythms, repetition. Within hours she had cracked the code, revealing enemy naval coordinates. Her work saved lives, though no one told her that directly. When the report was submitted, it bore another man's signature. Her contribution was erased. Still, she kept going. She worked nights until her eyes burned, solving cipher after cipher, her mind whirring faster than anyone gave her credit for. She told herself it didn't matter whose name appeared on the report. What mattered was the victory, the lives spared. Yet each time she was passed over for recognition, the weight grew heavier. In the nursing home, Dorothy shut her eyes against the sting of memory. The letter in her lap wasn't just an honor. It was a reminder of all the years she had been invisible. Her thoughts drifted back to Harper. The photograph she had given her granddaughter was one of the few she kept from those years. She had wanted Harper to see her as more than an old woman in soft sweaters, to know there had been a time when she stood tall, uniform pressed, part of something far bigger than herself. But Harper had her own battles. Dorothy knew that. She had seen the hesitation in her granddaughter's eyes, the way her voice faltered. Harper carried silence like armor, just as Dorothy once had. She lifted the letter again, rereading the final lines. "In recognition of your contributions, you are to be honored at a forthcoming ceremony." Her lips pressed into a thin line. Honor, at this age, was almost laughable. Where had this honor been when she was 40, working as a clerk while her white colleagues ascended? Where had this honor been when she buried her husband and raised her daughter alone, her service forgotten by the very nation she had helped protect? Still, a quiet fire stirred within her. Maybe this was not for her. Maybe it was for Harper to see her grandmother not as someone diminished by age, but as someone who had fought battles no one spoke of. The thought brought her upright. She folded the letter carefully, tucking it back into its envelope. She would not let it sit hidden in a drawer. She would bring it into the light, even if her voice trembled as much as her hands now did. A knock came at her door, and her nurse peeked in. "You doing all right, Miss Lewis?" Dorothy nodded, forcing a steady smile. "Just fine, dear. Just remembering." When the door closed, her gaze returned to Harper's photo on the nightstand. The girl's eyes, so soft and uncertain, seemed to plead for guidance. Dorothy whispered to the empty room. "You're not weak, Harper. You just don't know yet what you carry." She pushed herself to her feet, joints aching, but her resolve steady. She crossed to the small dresser where she kept a wooden box, its surface scratched from years of moves and handling. Inside lay the medals she had never shown anyone, the commendations that bore her name even if no one outside the government had cared to acknowledge them. She touched each one, her fingers trembling, and then laid the letter beside them. A plan began to take shape in her mind. She would not wait for the government's ceremony to define her story. She would tell it herself, and she would start where it mattered most, at Harper's school. She pictured the auditorium, the rows of students, the teachers lined along the walls. She pictured Mrs. Aldridge, with her smug smile and dismissive tone, belittling Harper, until the child believed silence was her destiny. Dorothy's jaw tightened. She would not allow it, not when she still had breath left in her body. Her hand lingered on Harper's photograph once more. Then she whispered, "If they want to honor me, they'll do it on my terms. And Harper will see exactly who she comes from." The envelope on her dresser caught the light, the insignia gleaming faintly. Dorothy's reflection in the dresser mirror showed not a frail old woman, but a figure slowly reclaiming her voice. Dorothy pressed her palm flat against the letter and made her decision. She would attend Harper's next school event, armed with the truth they had all ignored for too long. The week after Dorothy's quiet decision, the school's loudspeaker crackled to life one gray Monday morning. Harper sat in her first period classroom, her head bent low, trying to stay invisible. She traced the edge of her notebook with her finger when the principal's voice boomed across the intercom. "Attention students. This year Jefferson High will host its annual talent showcase, a night of celebration and creativity. Singers, dancers, musicians, poets. This is your chance to shine." And this year, for the very first time, the entire event will be live streamed for families and the community. A chorus of gasps and whispers erupted across the classroom. A live stream meant more than just the school. It meant strangers, neighbors, parents, and even people across town would be watching. Phones buzzed as students exchanged ideas and dared each other to sign up. But Harper's stomach dropped. She gripped the sides of her desk. Live streamed. The word felt like a spotlight crashing onto her. She imagined herself standing there, stuttering in front of the entire town, frozen, while the world laughed. And yet another thought bloomed quietly in the corner of her mind. The piano. Harper's fingers twitched unconsciously, remembering the weight of the keys beneath them, the way melodies slipped through her hands with ease. At home, she played until her wrists ached, her stutter dissolving into rhythm, her silence replaced with music. Her mother often stood in the kitchen doorway, tears in her eyes, saying softly, "Harper, when you play, you speak clearer than anyone I've ever heard." But no one at school knew. It was her secret, her sanctuary. As the class murmured excitedly, Mrs. Aldridge clapped her hands sharply. "Quiet down, everyone. A talent show is hardly an excuse to lose focus." She scanned the room, her eyes landing deliberately on Harper. "Though I suppose for some of you, this might be your only chance to be heard." Still she tilted her head, lips curling. Not everyone is suited for a stage. A ripple of laughter followed. Harper's cheeks burned. She sank lower in her seat. During lunch, the cafeteria buzzed with talk of the showcase. Flyers were already being handed out. "I'm doing a dance routine with my cousins," one girl boasted. "We're going viral for sure." A boy across the table announced he would perform stand-up comedy, his friends egging him on. In the corner, Harper nibbled at her sandwich, the flyer folded in her pocket. She wanted to rip it up, to silence the dangerous idea stirring inside her. But instead, she fingered the paper over and over, imagining her hands gliding across piano keys in front of an audience, proving, if only for a moment, that she was more than her stutter. That afternoon, Harper lingered by the sign-up sheet, posted outside the auditorium. Students crowded around, scribbling their names eagerly. She stood a few feet back, paralyzed. Her heart raced at the thought of adding her own name. She could already hear Miss Aldridge's voice. "Don't embarrass yourself." And then, as if summoned, Mrs. Aldridge's heels clicked down the hallway. She stopped when she saw Harper near the sheet. "Thinking of signing up?" Mrs. Aldridge asked, her tone light but her eyes sharp. Harper swallowed hard. "I maybe." Mrs. Aldridge chuckled softly. "Oh, Harper. Performing requires confidence, presence, the ability to command a room. You," she paused, leaning closer, struggled just to finish a sentence. "Do you really want to embarrass yourself? And your family?" The words sliced through Harper like glass. She felt her throat close, her body shrinking against the wall. She shook her head quickly. No, ma'am. Good. Mrs. Aldridge's smile widened, satisfied. It's best to know our limitations. That's wisdom. She walked away, leaving Harper frozen in place. Students nearby had overheard, snickering as they passed. Harper wanted to scream, to cry, to run, but instead she turned away from the sheet, the flyer burning in her pocket. That night, Harper sat at her piano, fingers hovering over the keys. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. She closed her eyes and pressed a single note. Then another. Soon a melody poured from her hands, soft at first, then swelling with emotion she couldn't voice anywhere else. Her chest loosened, her breath steadying as the music filled the silence. She played for nearly an hour, the song shifting from sorrow to defiance, each note a declaration she couldn't say aloud. When she finished, her mother stood in the doorway, her face wet with tears. "Baby," Rochelle whispered, "if the world heard you play, they'd never see your stutter again. They'd only see your gift." Harper wiped her eyes, shaking her head. Mrs. Aldridge said, "I'd embarrass myself. That I'd embarrass you." Rochelle's expression hardened. "That woman has been wrong about you since the first day she laid eyes on you. Don't let her decide what you are." But Harper's silence hung heavy between them. She wanted to believe her mother, but Mrs. Aldridge's voice echoed louder in her mind. The next morning, Harper passed the auditorium again. The sheet was nearly full now. Only a few lines remained blank. Her chest tightened as she read the names: singers, dancers, comedians. She lingered for a moment, fingers itching to grab the pen. Before she could move, she heard voices drifting from inside the auditorium. The door was cracked open. Harper paused. It was Mrs. Aldridge's voice. "She'll never survive up there," the teacher said, her tone amused. "If Harper tries, I'll make sure the audience sees exactly what she is. Dead weight. It'll be the perfect lesson in knowing your place." Harper's stomach twisted. She pressed her ear closer, her breath shallow. Another teacher's voice answered hesitantly. "Don't you think that's a bit harsh?" "Harsh?" Mrs. Aldridge laughed lightly. "It's realistic. Some students need to be shown their limits. Better they learn now than carry false hope into adulthood." The words hit Harper like thunder. Her heart pounded so loud, she was afraid they might hear it through the door. Tears welled in her eyes, but behind them something else flickered, something sharp and unfamiliar. For the first time, Harper wasn't only ashamed, she was angry. Harper stepped back from the auditorium door, her fists clenched. For the first time she began to consider something dangerous, signing up anyway, if only to defy Mrs. Aldridge's plan to humiliate her. The hallways of Jefferson High were almost empty when Harper finally slipped into the auditorium one afternoon. She had waited until most of the students had gone home, clutching her notebook and glancing over her shoulder at every turn. The sign-up sheet for the talent show was taped to the wall just outside, nearly full now, her name still missing. She hadn't signed up yet, but the thought of playing piano on that stage wouldn't leave her alone. The auditorium smelled faintly of dust and wood polish, its rows of chairs stretching into shadow. At the far end, the grand piano sat silent, its surface gleaming faintly beneath the dim stage lights. Harper approached it slowly, her heartbeat quickening. She slid onto the bench and let her fingers hover above the keys. At first she pressed just one note, soft and tentative, then another. Soon a melody formed, fragile but alive. The sound wrapped around her, filling the cavernous space with warmth. Harper closed her eyes, leaning into the rhythm. Here alone, there was no stutter, no laughter, only music that spoke the words she could never say. What she didn't realize was that someone else was listening. From the side of the stage, near the equipment closet, Elijah Brooks paused with his mop in hand. He had been finishing his evening rounds, the slow routine of sweeping and polishing floors, when the music drifted to him. At first he thought it was a recording, but then he stepped closer and saw Harper, small, tense, transformed at the piano. He leaned against the wall, letting the melody wash over him. A pang of recognition struck his chest. He knew that sound, not just the piano itself, but the way it was played, with hunger, with a need to be heard. When Harper's song finally ended, she let her hands fall into her lap, sighing heavily. That was when Elijah cleared his throat. Harper jumped, spinning around. Her eyes widened when she saw him. "I didn't know anyone was here." Elijah smiled gently. "Didn't mean to scare you. I was just listening." Her cheeks flushed. "It's nothing. Just practicing." He stepped onto the stage slowly, his work boots heavy against the wooden floor. That didn't sound like nothing. That sounded like somebody who's got something worth sharing. Harper shook her head. No, nobody cares. And if they did, she trailed off, staring at the keys. I'd just mess it up. Like everything else. Elijah set his mop aside and sat on the edge of the stage. You know, people have been telling me that my whole life, that what I do don't matter. That I'm just the janitor. He chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. Kids walk by me every day, act like I'm invisible. Some teachers too, like I'm part of the furniture. Harper looked at him surprised. But here's the thing, Elijah continued. Before I was cleaning floors, I was playing piano. Better than most. I auditioned for Juilliard once. Got all the way to the final round. But when I showed up, wearing my best suit, some folks looked at me like I was out of place. Like a black man didn't belong in their hall. They didn't have to say it out loud. I felt it in the way they looked at me. And when the rejection letter came, I already knew why. Harper's eyes softened. I didn't know you played. Not many people do. Elijah leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I stopped telling folks after a while. Too many laughs. Too many you sure you know what you're doing looks. But the piano, his eyes flicked to the instrument. It don't lie. It don't care about your skin, or your stutter, or what people think you're worth. It only tells the truth. Harper swallowed hard. His words echoed something deep inside her. When I play, she whispered, it's like I can finally talk, like the words don't break anymore. Elijah nodded slowly. Then that's your truth. Don't let anybody take it from you. For the first time in weeks, Harper felt something loosen in her chest. She looked at Elijah differently now, not just as the janitor who swept the halls, but as someone who carried scars like hers, someone who knew what it was to be underestimated. Will you help me? She asked softly. Elijah tilted his head. Help you how? With the talent show. She hesitated, fear flickering across her face. I want to play, but I'm scared. Elijah's smile widened, just slightly. Scared means it matters. Sure, I'll help. And so their secret rehearsals began. Every afternoon, after most students had gone, Harper met Elijah in the auditorium. He showed her small tricks, how to breathe with the music, how to use her whole body instead of just her hands, how to let the emotion lead instead of fighting the notes. Harper listened intently, her fingers quick to learn, her music growing bolder each day. Together they filled the empty auditorium with sound. Elijah occasionally sat beside her, his own fingers flying across the keys in dazzling bursts that left Harper breathless. She had never heard anyone play like that. Not Lev, not this close. Why don't you perform? She asked one day, watching him lift his hands from the keys. He shrugged. People see what they want to see. To them, I'm a janitor, not a musician. His eyes softened. But maybe if you get up there and play, maybe they'll see different. Maybe they'll start listening. Harper absorbed his words, a spark of courage flickering in her chest. Each day she grew stronger, more certain, her music becoming not just practice but defiance. But courage has a way of drawing attention. One Friday afternoon, Harper was deep in rehearsal, her fingers dancing across the piano, while Elijah kept time by tapping his foot lightly on the stage. Neither of them noticed the faint creak of the auditorium door opening. 3 students slipped inside, 2 boys from Harper's English class, and a girl with a phone already raised. They exchanged mischievous looks, holding back laughter as they crept closer. Mute girls practicing for the big show, one of them whispered, his voice carrying just enough. The girl's phone caught every second. The lens pointed straight at Harper. They recorded her hunched over the keys, the sound of her music filling the space. Then the boy whispered louder, mocking her stutter. Play it again, Harper. The others stifled laughter, the phone shaking with their amusement. Elijah turned his head sharply, his jaw tightening when he saw them. But before he could say anything, the students darted out, laughter echoing as the door slammed shut behind them. Harper froze, her hands falling still on the keys, her face drained of color. She knew what had just happened. Her secret was no longer hers. That night, Harper lay in bed staring at the glow of her phone, her heart pounding as she watched the video of herself already spreading online, captioned, "Stuttering girl thinks she can play." By Saturday morning, Harper's phone would not stop buzzing. Notifications piled up one after another, the screen glowing each time she turned it over, trying to ignore it. But curiosity and dread gnawed at her until she finally tapped the screen open. The video was everywhere. On Instagram, TikTok, even reposted on Twitter with different captions. It showed her at the piano in the empty auditorium, her back slightly hunched, her face tense with concentration. At first the music sounded clear enough, gentle notes filling the space, but then the camera zoomed in, capturing her lips moving as she hummed quietly to herself, catching on the stutter that sometimes crept into her breathing. The captions cut like knives. Mute girl thinks she can play. Jefferson's piano clown. Tap stutter tap now with music. Some edits layered laugh tracks over her playing. Others slowed the video to exaggerate her movements, making her look awkward, strange. One post had already gathered thousands of views, students piling into the comments with jeers. She really thought she was good. Someone tell her to stick to silence. Mrs. A was right. Some people shouldn't even try. Harper sat frozen on her bed, the phone trembling in her hands. She felt her chest tighten as though the world had collapsed on her. All those hours at the piano, all the courage she had built with Elijah, erased in a flood of cruelty. Her mother knocked softly on the door. "Harper, you okay?" Harper shoved the phone under her pillow. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice shaky. But Rochelle saw the redness in her daughter's eyes when she entered. She sat beside her on the bed, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "What happened?" Harper shook her head, biting her lip hard to keep from crying. "They saw me play. Now everybody's laughing. They made me into a joke." Rochelle clenched her jaw, anger flashing in her eyes. "Kids can be cruel. But Harper, you can't let them decide who you are. You know your worth." But Harper shook her head violently. "No, I don't. Not anymore." Mew. On Monday, the whispers followed her down the hall like shadows. Every step felt like walking through quicksand. Students glanced at her, then at their phones, smirking as if she couldn't see. One boy leaned against his locker and tapped an imaginary piano, mimicking her stutter with each fake note. Harper pressed forward, her face burning, her throat tight. She wanted to vanish, to become invisible again. But now invisibility was impossible. She had been exposed, and the whole school was in on the joke. During English class, Mrs. Aldridge didn't mention the video outright, but the edge of her smile said everything. When Harper hesitated on a reading assignment, Mrs. Aldridge muttered, just loud enough for the room to hear, "Well, at least she can still play piano." Sort. The students chuckled softly, the sound cutting through Harper like glass. After class, Elijah found her sitting alone in the empty cafeteria, her lunch untouched. He sat across from her, folding his large hands on the table. "I saw the video," he said gently. Harper's eyes welled again. "It's ruined. Everything's ruined. Nobody will ever see me as anything but a joke now." Elijah shook his head firmly. "That ain't true. They saw a piece of you, but not the whole. They caught you in practice, not in performance. They don't know the fire that comes when you play for real." Harper sniffled, shaking her head. "It doesn't matter. People already made up their minds." "Then change their minds," Elijah said, his voice steady. "Don't let them write your story for you. You've got something powerful, Harper. More powerful than their laughter. But the only way they'll see it is if you stand up and show them." His words settled heavily in her chest. Part of her wanted to believe him, but fear still clung tightly. By midweek, the video had spread beyond the school. Strangers were commenting now, piling onto the cruelty. Troll accounts made memes, dubbing over her playing with circus music. One caption read, "America's got, not the." What stung most was how the ridicule mirrored Mrs. Aldridge's cruelty. The online world seemed to confirm everything her teacher had said. Some people just aren't meant for excellence. The humiliation seeped into every corner of her life. In class, students snickered as she passed. In the cafeteria, kids played the video loudly at their tables, laughing until Harper fled the room. Even at home, the silence of her phone screen felt like an accusation. Every notification a reminder that the world had seen her and rejected her. Late one night, she crept into the living room and sat at the piano. Her hands hovered over the keys, but for the first time in years, she couldn't bring herself to play. Her fingers trembled, frozen. Tears blurred her vision. That was when Elijah's words returned to her. "They haven't seen your full truth yet." She pressed a single key. The note rang out, lonely but alive. Slowly, she added another, then another. The melody was shakier than before, but it grew, fragile and defiant. Her mother appeared quietly in the doorway, not saying a word. She simply listened, tears in her eyes. Meanwhile, across town, Dorothy Lewis sat in her nursing home, with the television murmuring faintly in the background. She rarely paid attention to the channels. Most days it was just noise to fill the silence. But this night the screen showed a familiar building, Jefferson High. Dorothy leaned forward. On the news segment, an anchor described a viral video from the school, showing a student at the piano. The clip played Harper, her granddaughter, her private sanctuary turned into entertainment for the masses. Dorothy's breath caught in her throat. Her frail hands tightened on the arms of her chair. She recognized that look on Harper's face, the mixture of focus and vulnerability, the raw courage of putting yourself into something the world might destroy. The anchor continued. The video has sparked debate online, with some praising the student's courage while others mock her abilities. The school has not released a statement. Dorothy reached for her phone with trembling fingers. She replayed the clip again and again, her chest tight with fury and sorrow. This was not just Harper's humiliation. It was history repeating itself. She remembered the smirks of her white colleagues at Arlington Hall, the quiet erasure of her victories, the way people dismissed her brilliance before she even touched the cipher sheets. But Dorothy also remembered what it felt like to defy them, to break a code they thought unbreakable, to prove she could outthink the very men who sneered at her. Her hand hovered over Harper's number, then dropped. No, this wasn't a moment for a phone call. This was big. Dorothy pushed the video away and opened her dresser drawer, pulling out her war medals and the government letter. Her reflection in the mirror hardened as she whispered, "If they're going to laugh at her, they'll hear from me first." Dorothy sat in her small nursing home room, the government letter and her medals spread across her lap like a forgotten treasure, unearthed, the weight of them pressed into her thin legs, heavier than they had ever been in the past. As she traced the edge of one medal with her finger, the air around her seemed to thicken, drawing her backward into memory. It began, as it always did, with the sound of typewriters, a sharp, relentless clatter that filled the halls of Arlington Hall, where Dorothy had once been assigned as a young recruit. She had been 22 then, fresh-faced and hopeful, wearing her pressed uniform with pride. To her it wasn't just clothing, it was proof that she belonged to something greater, that she had a part to play in a war shaping the world's future. But pride had quickly met reality. The first day, she had been escorted not into the main decoding room, but into a smaller, windowless space at the far end of the building. There half a dozen other black women sat at desks, their eyes lifting when Dorothy entered. Some were typing requisition orders, others were sorting incoming papers. Their faces carried the same mixture of dignity and quiet resignation. "This is where you'll work," a white officer said briskly, tossing a stack of intercepted enemy transmissions onto her desk. His gaze lingered on her just long enough to slice away her pride. "Don't get confused. You're here to type, not to think." Dorothy had nodded then, biting her tongue. But inside, something burned. She stared at the coded strings of numbers and letters. Nonsense to most, but to her they held patterns. She had always seen patterns others missed in music, in words, in the hum of machines. One evening, when the others had left, Dorothy stayed behind. She spread the coded sheets across her desk, pencil in hand, her heart pounding as she scribbled possibilities. Hours passed. The room grew cold. But by dawn she had cracked the cipher, revealing a set of coordinates that aligned with naval maps she had studied. She rushed to her superior, her hands trembling with both exhaustion and excitement. The officer barely looked at her. "Who gave this to you?"
I worked it out, sir," Dorothy said, her voice firm despite her fear.
He laughed, a short dismissive sound. "You expect me to believe a colored secretary cracked an enemy cipher overnight?" He snatched the paper from her hand. "Next time, don't waste your time pretending." Her face flushed, but she said nothing. She watched as he carried the sheet away, knowing full well it would reach command, knowing it might save lives. But when the commendation was later announced, it bore his name, not hers. That was the first of many times. Dorothy's mind reeled through them now. Nights of exhaustion, breakthroughs hidden in drawers, reports signed by men who never touched the ciphers. Each time her contribution disappeared beneath the weight of prejudice. Yet she had persisted, driven by the knowledge that her work mattered even if no one said her name. She remembered one particularly bitter night, in 1944. She had cracked a message indicating German submarines were positioning near the Atlantic convoy routes. If left unchecked, countless soldiers and supplies would be lost. She had sprinted to her superior's office, practically shoving the decrypted message into his hands. He had glanced at it, then, at her. You must have copied this wrong. I'll have Corporal Whitman review it. Sir, Dorothy said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. If we delay, men will die. He frowned, as though annoyed by her insistence. That's enough. Return to your desk. Hours later, when Whitman confirmed the same coordinates Dorothy had already given, an urgent dispatch was sent out. The attack was prevented. The victory was celebrated. Whitman's name was praised in reports. Dorothy wasn't even mentioned. That night she sat at her desk long after the others had gone, her fists clenched so tightly, her nails cut into her palms. She told herself it didn't matter, that lives had been saved, and that was the point. But deep down, the truth stung. Brilliance was not enough to silence racism. Back in her nursing home chair, Dorothy blinked away the tears that welled in her aging eyes. Decades had passed, yet the sting of those moments remained as fresh as the day they happened. And now, watching Harper's humiliation play out on screens across the city, she recognized the same wound being cut into her granddaughter's spirit. She could not let Harper carry the silence that she herself had been forced to swallow. Dorothy reached into the wooden box on her dresser, pulling out not only her medals, but the few surviving photographs and documents she had hidden over the years. Some were yellowed with age, the ink fading, but they were proof that she had been more than a secretary, more than an afterthought, proof that she had been essential, whether the world had admitted it or not. Her hands shook as she spread them across her bed. The room seemed to hum with the energy of her past, the ghosts of nights she had spent decoding messages, while men dismissed her. She picked up a small silver medal, holding it tightly in her palm, and whispered, "They never saw me, but Harper will." She rose slowly, joints aching but her resolve strong. One by one, she tucked the medals and documents into a worn leather satchel. Her reflection in the mirror stared back, not frail but fierce, as though the young woman she once was had returned for a final battle. "Harper," she murmured, "you will not stand alone. Not while I still have breath." Her hand lingered on the government letter one last time. An official ceremony might have been enough once, but not now. Now she would make her stand in the very place where Harper was being broken down. Dorothy closed the satchel, straightened her shoulders, and whispered to herself, "I'm going to that school." The night before the talent show, Harper sat at her piano, staring at the keys without moving a finger. The house was dimly lit, her mother asleep after a long shift, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. Normally this was the hour when Harper's music flowed most freely, when she could lose herself in sound. But tonight her hands felt heavy, lifeless. The humiliation of the viral video still clung to her skin like a stain she couldn't scrub away. Every time she thought about walking onto that stage, her chest constricted, her stomach churned. She could already hear the whispers, the laughter, the mocking comments replayed in her head. Tomorrow would be worse than the video. Tomorrow the world wouldn't just laugh at her behind screens. They'd laugh live in real time. Her fingers hovered above the keys, then retreated. She couldn't do it. She would not survive it. A soft knock at the door startled her. Harper froze, then stood quickly and opened it to find Elijah standing in the hallway, still in his work uniform. His boots were dusty, and his eyes carried the weariness of someone who had put in a long day. But in his hands he carried a sheet of music, edges worn from years of folding. "You're still up," Harper whispered. He nodded. "Figured you might be." Harper stepped aside, letting him into the living room. He set the paper gently on the piano. "You're thinking of backing out, aren't you?" Elijah asked, his voice low but steady. Harper's silence answered for her. Elijah sighed, pulling out the bench and sitting beside her. "I know that look. I've worn it myself." For a moment, neither spoke. Then, without warning, Elijah placed his hands on the keys. The sound that burst forth was unlike anything Harper had ever heard in person. Bold chords, delicate trills, and swift runs cascaded from his fingers with precision and emotion, so raw it felt as though the piano itself were weeping and roaring at once. Harper sat frozen, watching in awe as Elijah played. His body moved with the rhythm, his head tilting slightly, his eyes closed in a world of his own. It was music that commanded the room, music that demanded to be listened to. When the final note rang and faded into silence, Harper exhaled shakily. "I didn't know you could play like that." Elijah chuckled softly, though his eyes held something darker. Most people don't. Most people don't care to know." He leaned back, his hands resting on his knees. "I auditioned for Juilliard once, when I was about your age. Walked in with a head full of hope, wearing my best suit. I played my heart out, just like you heard now. When I finished, the room was quiet. Not the good kind of quiet. The kind that says you don't belong there. Harper's eyes widened. What did they say? Elijah's jaw tightened. One of the judges told me I had talent. But his words after that burned. You'd make a fine accompanist in a jazz club, but Juilliard isn't for you. He didn't have to spell it out. What he meant was, Juilliard wasn't for a black janitor's son. I was out before I even started. Harper's heart sank. She could see the pain in his eyes, the wound still raw, even after all these years. That's not fair, she whispered.
No, it wasn't,
Elijah admitted. But here's the thing. I let it define me. I let them tell me I wasn't enough. And instead of fighting back, I walked away.
Been cleaning floors ever since.
When I could have been filling concert halls. That's what happens when you believe the lies people tell about you. His gaze fixed on Harper, sharp and unflinching. Don't make my mistake. Harper swallowed hard, her chest tightening. But what if they laugh? What if I mess up? They'll laugh whether you mess up or not, Elijah said bluntly. That's what they do. People like Mrs. Aldridge, people who think the world already has you figured out. They'll always find something to mock. The only way to beat them is to prove you don't care, that their laughter doesn't stop your music. Harper's eyes filled with tears. For weeks she had carried her silence like a curse. Now Elijah's words carved a new possibility in her heart. Maybe her silence wasn't weakness. Maybe it was the space she needed to gather strength for something bigger. Elijah reached for the worn sheet of music he had brought. This was the piece I auditioned with. I want you to play it. Harper shook her head quickly. I couldn't. Yes, you can, Elijah said firmly. It's complicated, but so are you. And if you can master this, you'll walk onto that stage tomorrow knowing there's nothing they can take from you. Slowly, hesitantly, Harper placed her fingers on the keys. The notes stumbled at first, awkward and unsure, but Elijah guided her, tapping the rhythm, murmuring corrections, coaxing her forward. Little by little, the melody began to take shape beneath her hands. They practiced for nearly an hour, the music filling the living room with a mixture of mistakes and breakthroughs, laughter and frustration. At the end, Harper collapsed against the keys with a tired smile. You'll get it, Elijah said softly. And when you do, you'll break them. You'll break their code, Harper. That night, long after Elijah left, Harper lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Her body was tired, but her mind buzzed. She drifted into restless sleep, the music still echoing faintly in her ears. In her dream, she stood on a vast stage, the lights blinding, the audience a faceless blur. Her hands trembled above the piano. Then from the shadows, a figure stepped forward, her grandmother, Dorothy, in full uniform, her medals glinting under the lights. Dorothy's voice was steady, commanding. Harper, break the code. Harper jolted awake, her chest heaving. The words rang in her ears, as though carried from another world. Harper sat up in bed, realizing her grandmother's past and her own future were tied together in ways she could no longer ignore. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to run or to break the code. The morning of the talent show, Harper woke with a knot in her stomach. The dream of her grandmother's voice still echoed faintly in her ears. Break the code. It had been so vivid that she could almost feel Dorothy's hand on her shoulder. But in the brightness of day, courage seemed harder to hold on to. At Jefferson High, excitement buzzed through the halls. Posters advertising the live-streamed showcase were taped to lockers, and students carried costumes, instruments, and props through the corridors. Harper kept her eyes down, slipping through the crowd like a shadow. Her hands clutched her music sheets, damp with sweat. As she entered the auditorium, a hush rippled through a cluster of students near the door. Whispers followed her. That's her, the piano girl. Think she'll choke? Laughter quickly muffled, chased her steps. Harper's chest tightened, but she forced herself forward. She had promised Elijah she would try. She had promised herself she would not let Mrs. Aldridge win. But nothing could have prepared her for what she saw when she turned toward the front rows. Dorothy Lewis, in her neatly pressed dress suit and polished shoes, walked slowly but deliberately down the aisle. The satchel on her shoulder tugged against her frail frame, but her back was straight, her chin lifted. The light caught the faint gleam of the medals pinned discreetly to her lapel. Students whispered, puzzled. Who's that old lady? Why is she dressed like that? Is that her grandma? Harper's breath caught. For a moment she forgot the piano, forgot the fear. Dorothy was here. Mrs. Aldridge, standing near the judge's table, noticed the stir and arched her brow. She stepped forward with a tight smile. "Can I help you, ma'am?" Dorothy met her gaze calmly. "I'm here to watch my granddaughter." "Oh." Mrs. Aldridge's lips pursed in mock politeness. "Well, I suppose family is welcome. But you must understand, this is a modern showcase. We'll need the front rows for faculty and important guests." Her eyes flicked to Dorothy's outfit, the old-fashioned cut of her jacket, the medals gleaming faintly. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in the back. Less attention on you." Dorothy's jaw set. Her voice, though quiet, cut through the murmurs. "I'll sit in the front. I want her to see me." There was no anger in her tone, only certainty. It was the kind of certainty that comes from a lifetime of being dismissed and choosing, every time, to stand anyway. Mrs. Aldridge's smile faltered for the briefest second, but she recovered, gesturing toward a side section. "Very well, but do try not to distract anyone." Students nearby stifled chuckles, glancing at Dorothy's attire. One whispered, "Looks like she walked out of a history book." Another muttered, "Why's she wearing medals? Did she buy those at a thrift shop?" Harper heard every word, each one twisting like a knife. But when Dorothy caught her eye from across the room, she gave the smallest nod, a signal of strength passed silently between them. Harper inhaled sharply. For the first time, she felt she might not be facing this moment alone. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Backstage, the chaos of performers preparing swirled around Harper. Dancers stretched, singers rehearsed scales, comedians muttered their jokes under their breath. Harper sat on a folding chair, her sheet music trembling in her lap. Elijah leaned against the wall nearby, his presence steady, a silent anchor. "You good?" he asked gently. Harper swallowed hard. "She came. My grandmother. She's here." Elijah smiled faintly. "Then she already knows what you're made of. All you gotta do now is show everyone else." Harper nodded, though fear still gripped her chest. As the show began, students filed onto the stage one after another. The audience clapped, cheered, shouted encouragement. Harper watched from the wings, her nerves building with each act. Between performances, Dorothy sat rigid in the front row, her satchel resting on her lap. She applauded politely, but her gaze kept returning to the wings where Harper waited. Her eyes were steady, unwavering. Mrs. Aldridge drifted past occasionally, her smile never reaching her eyes. "Don't push yourself, Harper," she murmured once in passing. "If the nerves get too strong, it's better to step aside gracefully than make a spectacle." Elijah bristled, but Harper clenched her fists, refusing to reply. She let Dorothy's steady presence in the front row be her answer. Then, just before Harper's turn, Dorothy rose from her seat. Slowly, deliberately, she made her way to the stage. The chatter of the auditorium dimmed as students and parents watched the elderly woman climb the steps. Mrs. Aldridge hurried forward, her heels clicking sharply. "Excuse me, ma'am. This is highly irregular. We have a schedule." Dorothy raised a hand, silencing her without a word. She leaned close, her voice low but firm. "I won't be long, but I will be heard." Mrs. Aldridge's eyes widened, her mask of politeness slipping. She glanced at the crowd, aware that all eyes were on them. Dorothy turned toward the stage microphone, her medals catching the light. Her voice, though raspy with age, carried across the auditorium. "Before my granddaughter plays," she said, "I'd like to say something." A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. Harper's heart thudded in her chest, her hands clutching the sheet music so tightly it crumpled. Mrs. Aldridge stepped forward quickly, her smile tight, her voice sharp. "This is not part of the program," she hissed, trying to pull Dorothy back. But Dorothy did not move. Her hand rested firmly on the microphone, her eyes blazing. The auditorium had fallen into an uneasy silence. Dorothy's sudden appearance at the microphone had unsettled everyone. But after Mrs. Aldridge tugged her gently back toward her seat, the program crept forward again. The audience clapped politely for the next performer, though the tension lingered like smoke. Backstage, Harper stood frozen in place. Her name had just been announced. Her palms were slick with sweat, her heart hammering against her ribs, as though trying to escape. She could barely hear the applause that greeted her introduction over the roar of her own fear. She stepped onto the stage, her shoes echoing against the wooden boards. The spotlight hit her, hot and blinding, and the sea of faces stretched endlessly before her. She tried not to look at them, but the whispers carried anyway. There she is, the piano clown. Wait for it, she's gonna choke. And then in the front row, she saw her teacher. Mrs. Aldridge leaned back comfortably in her seat, arms folded, lips curled into a knowing smirk. Her eyes gleamed with anticipation, as though she were about to watch a train wreck she had scripted herself. Harper's throat closed. Her legs felt weak. She slid onto the piano bench, her sheet music trembling in her hands. The murmurs swelled in the audience. They expected the girl from the viral video, the stuttering silence, the unfinished sentences. They expected failure. She laid the sheet music down, her fingers hovering above the keys. But they wouldn't move. They hung there, frozen, heavy as stone. Her breathing quickened. The auditorium grew louder in her ears, rustling, coughing, whispers that weren't really whispers. She could almost hear the laughter already, sharp and merciless. Go on. Mrs. Aldridge's voice cut through the noise, though she hadn't spoken loudly. It was just loud enough for Harper to hear. Don't keep us waiting. Again. The words pierced her like knives. She gripped her knees under the piano, trying to steady herself. The notes she had practiced endlessly blurred in her mind, slipping away into panic. In the wings, Elijah leaned forward, his hands clenched at his sides. He could see her trembling, could feel the weight pressing down on her. He had been here before, on stages, in audition halls, where eyes judged him before his fingers ever touched the keys. He knew that silence too well. Come on, Harper, he whispered under his breath. Harper's eyes darted toward the crowd again. She caught her grandmother's gaze. Dorothy sat tall in the front row, her medals gleaming faintly under the lights, her expression firm but soft. She nodded once, slowly, as though telling Harper, "You are not alone." But still, Harper's hands would not move. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. A few audience members shifted impatiently. Someone in the back coughed loudly, breaking the quiet. Then, from the middle rows, a boy whispered just loud enough to ripple across the room. She can't do it. Laughter bubbled, quiet at first, then spreading like a crack in glass. Harper's vision blurred with tears. Her chest ached, the panic clawing at her throat. She wanted to run, to flee the stage, and never come back. Then, from the shadows of the wings, Elijah stepped forward just enough for her to see him. He lifted one hand and curled his fingers, as if pressing invisible keys. His eyes locked on hers, steady and unshaken. His lips moved silently, but she read the words clearly. Play. The words struck through her fear, like a spark. Her fingers twitched. She remembered the late nights in her living room, Elijah guiding her hands across the keys. She remembered her mother whispering that her music was her true voice, and she remembered her dream, the vision of her grandmother in uniform, commanding her, break the code. The auditorium was waiting, the silence thick with expectation of failure. Harper inhaled sharply, her fingers trembling above the ivory keys, and then Harper pressed her first note, a sound that cut clean through the laughter, as Elijah whispered again from backstage, this time louder, play. The first note rang out like a small defiance. Harper's finger lingered on the key, letting the sound vibrate through the cavernous auditorium. The faint laughter that had rippled through the crowd only moments earlier stopped abruptly, as if silenced by that one fragile tone. She pressed another note, then another. Slowly, the melody began to take form, soft and tentative at first, like a bird testing its wings. Her hands trembled, but the sound, clear and resonant, grew steadier with each passing measure. For the first time all evening, the audience leaned in. A boy in the back, who had been smirking only seconds ago, tilted his head slightly. A girl who had been scrolling her phone lowered it into her lap. Even the hum of whispered jokes died away. Harper's hands moved faster now, memory and instinct guiding her. She had played these notes in her living room, late into the night when no one was watching, when the world felt too heavy to carry. But here, under the glare of the stage lights, the music was not just her escape, it was her voice. The stutter that tangled her speech melted into rhythm. Where her mouth stumbled, her hands flowed. Each chord rang with conviction, each phrase built into the next, like a story told without words. Backstage, Elijah stood frozen, his chest rising with pride. He had known Harper carried something powerful, but even he hadn't realized the depth of it until this moment. In the front row, Dorothy sat tall, her lips parting, ever so slightly. The music pulled her back to memories of coded transmissions, of nights when patterns and rhythms saved lives. She recognized what Harper was doing, turning brokenness into language, chaos into clarity. But not everyone was willing to let the music speak for itself. Mrs. Aldridge leaned toward a colleague beside her, her voice low but sharp. "It's not as impressive as it looks. Anyone can rehearse one piece until it's passable." She forced a laugh. "It's a trick like a parlor act. Once she falters, you'll see." The colleague didn't respond. His eyes stayed fixed on Harper, clearly unconvinced by Aldridge's attempt to control the narrative. Still, Mrs. Aldridge persisted, whispering again. "She's only proving my point. She hides behind the piano because she can't speak like the rest of us. It's pitiful, really." But Harper couldn't hear her. She was lost in the music now, her body swaying gently, her face no longer tense but open, almost radiant. The melody swelled, filling every corner of the room. And then came the turning point. She reached the piece Elijah had given her. The most difficult passage, a series of cascading notes that required precision and strength. Harper's fingers hesitated for a split second, fear flickering across her face. The audience sensed it. The silence became taut, as though the entire room held its breath, waiting for her to fail. Harper pressed forward, her fingers striking the keys, but one note slipped. The error was small, almost imperceptible, but in the stillness, it rang louder than the rest. A murmur spread through the crowd. Somewhere, someone snickered. Harper's chest tightened. Her hands faltered again, stumbling over the rhythm she had practiced so many times. The music wavered. From the judge's table, Mrs. Aldridge's lips curved into a thin smile. She leaned closer to her colleague, whispering with satisfaction. "There it is. She's unraveling." Harper froze. Her hands hovered above the keys, the unfinished chord hanging in the air like a wound. Her breath came fast and shallow, her vision blurring with panic. She could feel the audience's eyes pressing into her, waiting for the collapse, the humiliation. Her throat constricted. She wanted to run, to disappear before the laughter swallowed her whole. And then, a sound. Not from the piano but from the front row. Dorothy's chair scraped against the floor as she stood, her frail figure rising with unexpected strength. The metals on her lapel caught the stage light, flashing briefly. Gasps rippled through the crowd, as the elderly woman took a deliberate step forward, her eyes fixed on her granddaughter. Harper looked up, startled. For a moment the world seemed to hold still. The audience, the lights, the weight of her fear, all suspended as Dorothy's voice, low but steady, carried across the silence. "Play, Harper." Her words cut clean through the doubt. Dorothy took another step forward, her hand reaching into her satchel, as though pulling something hidden from the past, something she was ready, at last, to reveal. Dorothy's frail figure stood in the glow of the auditorium lights, her metals glinting faintly against her jacket, as if they too had been waiting for this moment. The silence that followed her first words was unlike any that had filled the space before, not the silence of ridicule or doubt, but the kind that precedes revelation. Harper sat frozen at the piano, her fingers hovering uselessly above the keys, her heart still pounding from her falter. She stared at her grandmother in disbelief, wondering what she was about to do. Dorothy's voice carried across the auditorium, firm though raspy with age. "You want to laugh at her for stumbling. You want to believe she is weak because her words come halting, because her silence makes you uncomfortable. But let me tell you something. I have lived that same silence, and I have seen what it hides." A murmur swept through the audience. Even the students who had whispered and mocked fell quiet, their curiosity overriding their cruelty. Dorothy reached into her satchel and pulled out a folded envelope, the one stamped with the insignia of the U.S. government. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice did not. "During World War II, I worked at a place called Arlington Hall. Few of you know it by name, but it was where coded enemy messages were broken. Lives depended on those codes being solved quickly. Mistakes meant ships sunk, soldiers lost, families broken." She unfolded the letter slowly, letting the paper catch the light. "I was one of the black women brought in to work on those ciphers, not to be recognized, not to be honored. They said we were just secretaries, but we weren't. We cracked codes that even the officers believed were impossible, and we did it while being told, every single day, that we weren't meant for excellence." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A boy in the third row whispered to his neighbor, "She's serious? She was in the war? His voice carried, but Dorothy pressed on. I remember handing in solutions and watching white officers sign their names to my work. I remember being told I could type, but not think. I remember nights when my eyes burned from exhaustion, when I deciphered enemy positions that saved convoys, and yet the reports went out under someone else's name. Her gaze swept across the audience, unflinching. Sound familiar? When brilliance is silenced, when talent is mocked, when worth is hidden under labels that don't fit. Every head in the room turned slowly back to Harper. The girl at the piano blinked hard, tears brimming in her eyes. Dorothy took another step forward. Her voice cracked but grew louder. Do you know how I survived? I found patterns where others saw nonsense. I found rhythm in chaos, and I learned that silence does not mean emptiness. Silence is waiting, waiting for its moment to be heard. Her eyes locked onto Harper's. Harper's music. This music she plays. It is the same gift. She takes brokenness and makes it whole. She takes pauses and stumbles and turns them into rhythm. She does with sound what I once did with codes. The room had gone utterly still. Even the restless students who usually scrolled through their phones during assemblies now sat wide-eyed, unmoving. On the far side of the auditorium, Elijah leaned against the wall, pride burning in his chest. As Dorothy's words washed over the crowd, he knew what it felt like to be underestimated, to be dismissed. Now the truth was rising in a place that had silenced too many voices. Dorothy lowered the letter and reached into her satchel again. This time, she pulled out a small case, worn and scratched from decades of storage. She opened it, revealing rows of service medals. The metal caught the stage lights, glimmering proof that could not be denied. These, Dorothy said, holding them up, were given to me in private. No ceremony, no applause, just a box in the mail. Because the world wasn't ready to see someone like me as a war hero. But I kept them. Because I knew the truth. Gasps filled the auditorium again. Parents leaned forward in their seats. Students craned their necks for a better look. Dorothy's gaze shifted, her expression hardening. She turned slowly toward the teachers' section, her eyes narrowing on Mrs. Aldridge. Mrs. Aldridge sat stiffly, her face pale, though her lips twitched into a forced smile. This is hardly the time, Miss Lewis, she muttered under her breath, but it carried just enough for those nearby to hear. Dorothy didn't waver. Her voice sharpened, cutting through the air. No, this is exactly the time. Because I've heard your words. I know how you've treated my granddaughter. I know you told her not to embarrass herself. That she wasn't meant for excellence. A sharp murmur ran through the audience. Parents shifted uncomfortably, exchanging looks. Students who had laughed at Harper now stared at their teacher in shock. Dorothy raised one trembling finger, pointing directly at Mrs. Aldridge. Her voice, though aged, thundered with a clarity that silenced the room. You dishonored my granddaughter. The words hung in the air like a gavel striking. Mrs. Aldridge's forced smile cracked, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. For the first time she looked cornered, as Dorothy stepped closer to the stage, prepared to say the one thing that could shatter the image Mrs. Aldridge had built for herself. Dorothy's words struck like thunder. For a long, suspended moment, no one moved. The audience, parents, students, teachers, sat frozen, caught between disbelief and awe. Harper, still perched at the piano, felt her throat tighten, as though her grandmother's voice had cracked open something long buried, not just in this room, but in the bones of the entire school. Then the silence shattered. The murmur of whispers surged into the air, like waves breaking against rock. Parents leaned toward each other, their faces pinched with concern. Students exchanged startled looks, and at the back of the auditorium, members of the school board seated together in a reserved section straightened in their chairs. They had been invited for the live-streamed showcase, to show their support for student achievement. Now they found themselves witnesses to an entirely different kind of performance. One board member, a heavy-set man with silver-rimmed glasses, scribbled furiously into a notepad. Another leaned toward the superintendent, whispering sharply, "Did you hear that? Did you hear what she just said?" The superintendent nodded grimly, his eyes locked on Mrs. Aldridge. Mrs. Aldridge, for her part, was pale beneath the stage lights. Her smile, thin, taut, had cracked, leaving only a mask of strained composure. She shifted in her chair, aware of the eyes now fixed, not on Harper but on her. "I think this has gone far enough," she said, forcing her voice into calm. "Ms. Lewis's recollections are interesting, but this is a school talent show, not a..." Dorothy raised her hand again, silencing her. You've shamed her long enough. Tonight, she will be heard. The room erupted in applause, soft at first, then swelling into something undeniable. Parents clapped. Students cheered. Even a few teachers joined in, their hands striking together in quiet defiance of Aldridge's authority. Harper's chest ached as the sound rolled over her. Applause, for her. Not because she had finished playing, but because someone had named the truth out loud. She blinked against the tears stinging her eyes. The superintendent stood, his voice carried across the auditorium, firm but steady. Mrs. Aldridge, we will be discussing this matter immediately after tonight's event. In light of what we've heard, I believe an internal investigation is warranted. Gasps cut through the room. Aldridge's head snapped toward him. An investigation? Based on a story from 70 years ago. No, the superintendent said sharply. Based on the treatment of your student. Tonight, the crowd erupted again, louder this time. Parents nodding, students clapping. Harper pressed her trembling hands to her lap, stunned. For so long, her silence had been a mark of shame. Now it was Mrs. Aldridge's silence that condemned her. Dorothy turned to Harper. Her eyes, though heavy with age, blazed with pride. Play, she said softly. Finish what you started. Harper swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she returned them to the keys. The crowd hushed instantly, leaning forward as the first notes poured into the air again. But this time Harper didn't play alone. From the wings, Elijah stepped forward. He sat quietly beside her on the bench, his long fingers brushing the keys in harmony with hers. Together their music swelled, two voices bound by shared scars, filling the auditorium with something too pure to be denied. The notes rose and fell like waves. Harper's hesitant but strong, Elijah's steady and commanding. Where she faltered, he filled the space seamlessly. Where she soared, he softened, letting her shine. It was not just a duet, it was a conversation across generations, across silences, a declaration that neither of them would be erased. By the time the last chord rang out, the auditorium was on its feet. Cheers erupted, louder than any applause of the night. Parents clapped furiously. Students who had once mocked Harper now shouted her name. Phones flashed, capturing every second, live streams filling with comments. She's incredible. This is history. That teacher should be ashamed. Harper bowed her head, overwhelmed. For the first time, the applause wasn't for a mistake narrowly avoided. It was for resilience, for truth. Dorothy dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, her lips trembling into a smile. Rochelle, Harper's mother, rushed from the aisle to wrap her daughter in a tight embrace. You did it, baby, she whispered, her voice breaking. You showed them. And for a fleeting moment, Harper felt weightless. She had broken the code of silence that bound her. But the moment wasn't finished yet. As the applause thundered, a tall, elegant woman rose from the middle rows and stepped into the aisle. Her tailored dress shimmered faintly under the lights, her jewelry understated but expensive. Her movements carried the kind of confidence that came from years of wealth and recognition. The crowd noticed her immediately. Whispers followed her as she walked toward the stage. That's Evelyn Sinclair, someone murmured. The billionaire philanthropist. Harper blinked in shock. She knew the name. Everyone did. Evelyn Sinclair's donations funded scholarships, hospitals, even parts of Jefferson High itself. Her presence here was unexpected and intimidating. Evelyn stopped at the edge of the stage, her gaze sweeping over Harper, Elijah, and Dorothy. Her expression was unreadable, poised between admiration and skepticism. Then, with a slight smile, she lifted her chin. That was impressive, she said, her voice carrying easily through the room. But I wonder, can you handle a real challenge? The audience stilled, confused murmurs rippling across the rows. Harper's pulse quickened. Evelyn's eyes locked on Elijah. You, the janitor. Her tone wasn't cruel, but dismissive, laced with disbelief. If you can truly play at the level I just witnessed, then prove it. Play this piano piece, something worthy of a concert hall. She paused, her voice dropping into a sharp challenge. And if you can, I'll make you an offer no one in this room will forget. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Phones lifted instantly, recording. Harper turned to Elijah, her heart hammering. He sat very still, his face unreadable, but his jaw clenched slightly, as though bracing for a storm. Evelyn Sinclair's words hung heavy in the air. As the crowd leaned forward, waiting, Elijah rose slowly from the bench, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Not in anger, but in decision. The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown at Elijah's feet. Evelyn Sinclair, the billionaire whose name graced the library wing, and whose influence stretched across the city, had fixed her eyes on him, as if she were deciding his worth with a single glance. The crowd murmured uneasily. Some whispered in awe at her presence. Others frowned at the casual arrogance in her tone. The janitor, she had called him, dismissing his identity the way Mrs. Aldridge had dismissed Harper's. Elijah stood slowly, his height casting a shadow across the piano. He looked down at his calloused hands, hands worn by mops, buckets, and years of unseen labor. The same hands that had once been rejected by Juilliard before they ever touched a key in that hall. He turned his gaze toward Evelyn. "You want me to prove myself?" His voice was calm but firm. "Fine. But understand something. My playing isn't for you. It's for her." He nodded toward Harper, whose wide eyes shimmered with tears, and for every person who was told they weren't meant for excellence. The audience stirred, struck by the weight in his words. Evelyn arched an eyebrow, as though amused by his defiance. "Then play," she said coolly, "and let's see if you're as remarkable as they think." Elijah lowered himself onto the bench. The hall fell into complete silence. Even the restless students, who had mocked Harper earlier, leaned forward, suddenly unsure of what they were about to witness. His fingers hovered above the keys, and then, without hesitation, he began. The first notes burst forth like fire. Unlike Harper's gentle beginnings, Elijah's playing was commanding from the first strike, flooding the auditorium with a sound so rich it seemed impossible that it came from a single instrument. His hands moved with breathtaking speed, cascading up and down the keys in arpeggios that shimmered like falling water. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Parents who had once seen him as a background figure now leaned forward in awe. Students who had laughed at his mop buckets and work boots sat slack-jawed, their phones raised in disbelief. The piece he played was not safe or simple. It was bold, unrelenting, demanding mastery. Each chord carried both ferocity and grace, his body swaying with the rhythm, sweat forming at his brow. Where Harper's music had been about fragile beauty, Elijah's was about undeniable power, the sound of a man refusing to be erased. Even Evelyn's poise faltered. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes narrowing not in disdain but in astonishment. Beside her, Dorothy clutched her satchel tighter, tears filling her eyes. She whispered under her breath, "Yes, yes, show them." Harper's heart pounded as she watched. She had always known Elijah was gifted, but to see him here in front of everyone who had belittled them both, it was like witnessing truth itself being played into existence. The music rose higher, faster, until it felt as though the very air shook with its force. Then, with a sudden shift, Elijah softened. The notes grew tender, weaving a melody so delicate it felt like a whisper between two souls. He was telling a story, his story, through the piano, a story of rejection, of being unseen, and of finally refusing to remain in the shadows. The final chord rang out and lingered in the air, vibrating through the auditorium until silence reclaimed the room. For several seconds, no one moved. The audience sat stunned, breathless, as if afraid to break the spell. Then, all at once, the room erupted into thunderous applause. Students leapt to their feet. Parents clapped until their hands stung. Even teachers who had looked past Elijah for years stood and cheered. Phones flashed wildly, capturing every angle, flooding social media with clips that would soon travel far beyond the walls of Jefferson High. Elijah sat still for a moment, his chest heaving, his hands trembling. Then he stood slowly, bowing his head, not to Evelyn, but to Harper. The billionaire philanthropist was the last to rise. Her carefully crafted composure cracked, and for the first time she looked shaken. She stepped closer to the stage, her voice lower now, edged with something almost like humility. "I underestimated you," Evelyn admitted, her words carrying across the stunned auditorium. "And I underestimated the girl who stood here before you." She turned her gaze briefly toward Harper, her tone softening. "You both forced us to see what we chose not to." The audience murmured, their eyes flicking between Evelyn and Elijah. Ellen took a breath, then added with a wry smile, "I said I would make you an offer no one would forget. I won't insult you with marriage, but I will fund a scholarship. For you, Elijah Brooks. For Harper Lewis. And for others like you, who have been overlooked, silenced and dismissed. If the system won't give you a stage, I will." Gasps and applause filled the room again, this time louder, tinged with disbelief. A billionaire's promise, made live, in front of the entire town. Elijah's lips parted slightly, his eyes widening. He had not expected this. Slowly, he nodded once. Then don't make it just about us. Make it for every kid they said wasn't good enough. Eleanor inclined her head. Agreed. The room shook with applause once more. Students cheered. Parents shouted. Phones streamed. And the story began to spread beyond the walls before the event even ended. On stage, Harper stood, her face radiant. The shame that had weighed her for months, the stutter, the laughter, the labels, melted away beneath the roar of applause. She looked at her grandmother, who wiped a tear from her cheek, and whispered through trembling lips, "The code is broken." Harper smiled, her chest swelling with a freedom she had never felt before. But even as the audience celebrated, Dorothy's words carried a gravity that only Harper seemed to understand. Breaking the code wasn't just about music, or even recognition. It was about shattering the silence that had haunted generations. As the applause thundered, cameras flashed capturing Dorothy, Harper, and Elijah together in the glow of the stage lights. Those images would be uploaded within minutes, racing across the internet, spreading the story far beyond Jefferson High. And yet, beneath the triumph, something stirred. A sense that this night was not an ending, but a beginning. That once the world saw them, it would not easily look away. As the crowd rose to its feet in tears, reporters already typing headlines, Harper glanced toward the glowing phones and flashing cameras. For the first time in her life, she realized the world was watching, and her story was about to spread far beyond her control. They tried to bury her voice, but tonight the truth was louder than their hate. If you've ever been silenced, if you've ever been underestimated, you know this fight isn't just hers, it's ours. Type yes if you believe every voice deserves to be heard, and subscribe if this story broke your heart.